of CEO and The Lobster, and this time, as always, we often like to talk about the most contentious and big news headlines that have been coming out in the crypto sphere. Last week, it was definitely taken away by Ledger and the massive furore that was caused over the updates they put out for the Ledger around around their seed recovery. So, Patrick, maybe what's your take on this? Is this actually a security issue, or is it just a PR disaster and a storm in a teacup?
So I think it changed how much trust people had in Ledger. Ledger's always had an issue with them not being open source, that they're kind of a black box. You don't kind of know what's going in there. And then they kind of came out with this update, which I think kind of made people think about it in a different way, that kind of like created concern in existing Ledger products. So they released this firmware update that essentially could pull your private keys off your ledger. They were meant to be sharded. They were meant to be only ever encrypted on the actual ledger device. But the fact that they could be pulled off and reassembled without the device, because that's the point of a recovery product, right? If you lose the device, you can recover the contents that's on that device without that device, raise some concerns, because suddenly it happens is, well, what happens if I haven't lost it, but somebody else wants to access it without this device? Or what happens if that's the police, right? And essentially it was this update that Ledger wanted to push, and they did tell people about it. To be fair, they did tell people about it. But the concern is, okay, well, if they can push it now, what could they have pushed without us knowing? Because again, they're not open source. They're a little bit of a black box. That was the issue. Wasn't unrecoverable. It was just making people have a little bit of doubt. But they amazingly made it worse. Janine, do you want to kind of talk about how they are?
Yeah. This was such a debacle. I mean, it's a really interesting lesson in corporate communications, and maybe something we'll be studying in universities and whatnot going forwards. But, so like you said, Patrick, the issue was they pushed out an update. They said this is to enable you to recover your seed phrase. That caused a lot of concern. And then they sort of doubled down by saying things like, well, technically it's always been possible for us to extract things off the device. And technically, but we would never need to do that unless, say, we got a subpoena from the government. And it was just like you say, people aren't necessarily thinking about these issues until they're put in front of them. And Ledger kind of, they raised more questions than they gave answers and sort of confidence to people. And I think the other key takeout for me from this is it's a really good lesson in knowing your audience as well. The CEO of Ledger came out saying, you're saying this is not what customers want. Actually, this is what future customers want. And I don't disagree with him, because what Ledger is doing is removing the fear and the issue that if I lose that hardware device and I haven't written down those 12 words somewhere, which, to be honest, not a great option for, confidence and security and storing your crypto, having to write down 12 words somewhere that's not online. So they were solving the problem that people have of, I could lose all of my crypto. They're like, hey, no, don't worry. We've come up with a way that you won't lose all of your crypto. But while that might be what the future customer wants, that is not what Ledger's existing customers want, because existing customers of hardware wallets are hugely security conscious, really want to know that their funds are safe, and they're using an offline storage system for, really specific reasons. And Ledger effectively just took that out from under them, pulled the tablecloth right out while they're sitting there eating dinner. And understandably, that got met with a massive backlash.
That's actually a really, really interesting point, right? Like, how could have Ledger have done this better? That their current customers are ones that have fundamentally bridged that gap that they're trying to bridge for future customers. They're people that have already gone through it. There's probably an element of survivorship bias. If I could get through it, anyone can get through it. Why does this? How could Ledger have actually handled this better then?
If I were them, and hindsight's a great thing, right? But I would have launched a completely separate hardware device. Give it a different name, call it something like, I think someone I've seen in crypto recently called something guaranteed recover. And I'm like, I like that, right? It's like the recovery of this is guaranteed. And then, clearly explain how that's guaranteed, how that's achieved. But while Ledger tried to do this somewhat through having this as an opt-in service, what they didn't necessarily think through fully is, while people can opt into paying for it, and this is, have to say, props to Ledger for putting a very interesting SaaS model around crypto storage. They were charging $9.99 a month for the recovery, this process, this guaranteed recovery. They gave it as an optional for their existing customers, but it's not really optional when the firmware update is pushed out. And Ledger users now are in the position of either never update the firmware if you don't want this to be possible on your device, or go and use a different hardware wallet. And then, like we said before, Ledger doubled down and made it worse by saying, well, you don't have to install the firmware update. It doesn't matter because technically we've always had the possibility to do this, which is, yeah.
Yeah, and that puts also the existing customers in a really interesting predicament, right? So say that they bought a product that they agreed with morally, ideologically, ethically then, and then Ledger has taken this right-hand turn, let's say, in polite language, and now they don't agree with it. They're in a really difficult position because, yeah, they could not update the firmware, but that's actually a security risk in and of itself. As attack vectors develop, as people get smarter, they're going to attack the older ones that haven't had those threats patched out yet. But if they get that, then they're having to sign up to something that they actually didn't sign up for when they bought the thing, right? So what options do they have other than like kind of moving away? Like the one I'd actually be really interested to hear your thoughts on is how does Ledger actually get out of this hole that they've dug themselves into? How do they move forward from here?
This, I am not sure because this has really been a double down and possibly they could move to open source, and I know they've been doing a bit of this, and that's a really big step in the right direction. I think open source, provisioning their software open source gives people the confidence and the ability. And there was a great and now deleted tweet by Ledger that says, technically speaking, it has and always has been possible to write firmware that facilitates key extraction. You have always trusted Ledger not to deploy such firmware, whether you knew it or not. And again, corporate comms disaster. But the fact that the software wasn't open source was the reason why we had to trust Ledger. And this is the very antithesis of crypto, is to trust a third party with your safety and your security. That goes against what a lot of really core philosophical crypto maxis believe. So a big step would be for Ledger to open source their software. That obviously undercuts their business model in a huge way, but they have the brand, they have the breadth. They're the biggest selling crypto hardware wallet by a very large margin. And if they're moving to a SaaS model, that shouldn't be a threat to their business to open source their key software. So that's what I would do if I were them. How about you? Would you go a different path, Patrick?
Yeah, look, I'm of two minds about it. So the open source stuff is really interesting to talk about, right? Because it opens it up for everyone to look at. It's often the point. One of the benefits of open source is that white hat groups can look at it, can make assessments, can make analyses, but also black hat groups can. Having something non-open source is actually, in a slightly different way, a protection mechanism because it means that people might not be able to learn about the third and fourth and fifth layers of security versus when something is open source, they can see the whole thing, right? So it almost exacerbates the problem of, say, if they went open source, but then all these existing users who don't want to get the updates, because there'll be a whole bunch of security updates that come out of making something open source, right? As people discover new potential attack vectors, there'll be security updates, but then you've got this pool of people who don't want to take those security updates. So it really kind of exacerbates their problem. I think they did the right step of walking away from this issue, just buying time. But I think they really need to focus on their brand and their current customers right now, because I see that as all well and good at focusing on these future customers, these potential people. But realistically, the ones paying the salaries right now are the people that you've just heard. With the battery issues, with the email hacks, and now this, I actually do see Trezor's brand as not damaged beyond repair, but it's just being chipped away at. And at some point, it's going to reach a critical.
Trezor's brand.
Oh, Ledger.
You mean Ledger?
Yeah, you can tell.
Trezor, on the other hand, is actually, and I have to say, I've always been a Trezor fan from way back because they're open source. And like you say, that does expose those, extra layers, but it also has massive benefits, particularly in an industry like crypto, where you have so many people who are very technically savvy and very incentivized to do that white hack job of looking through the tech stack and seeing if they can find vulnerabilities. Trezor, there is a known vulnerability with it, and I think in the wake of this Ledger debacle, that sort of resurfaced, but it's something that's been quite a few years old. So top tip for anyone who does have a Trezor and has perhaps heard, or whether you've heard of this issue or not, there is a way to extract the seed phrase from a Trezor if you have the physical device. But if you have used a passphrase, which is an optional security layer that you can put onto your Trezor, that hack is not, you can't do that. So as long as your Trezor, oh my goodness, now I'm struggling. As long as your Trezor is, physically doesn't fall into anyone else's hands, you're safe. And if it does fall into someone else's hands and you have put a passphrase on, you're still safe. So
Yeah.
I love Ledger. Oh my gosh, I love Trezor. We're going to have to like put a big disclaimer on this. So Ledger is good. They've had a lot of issues. This is a whole big debacle. Trezor has always been open source, which is a big plus in my mind. Their coin support and their innovation has been lacking, and I think that is where Trezor has fallen behind Ledger. But there are still lots of other options. Like, you know, we sell a whole bunch of things in the Easy Crypto store. I don't know, Patrick, if you've had experience with some of the other hardware wallets out there and have any views on what you would use if you were a Ledger user wanting to move on.
So I think for me with this, it's really hard to say one or the other. It's layers of protection, right? You don't want a single point of failure. So much like with the Trezors, well, okay, making sure no one has physical access to it is the first thing. Okay, cool. Making sure they wouldn't even know where to look for it is the second thing. Making sure there is a passcode on it. Making sure that, okay, even if then all of those things got hacked, then that's not everything, right? It's just about like
Yeah,
making yourselves as diversified as possible. And that, so I've brought up our store, right? Because we actually sell a wide range of options, and it's intentional that we sell a wide range of options. Because if we just sold one, then we're kind of boxing our customers in. Crypto is about choice, it's about diversification, it's about taking self ownership of these things. It's very important that you are the only one in control with your crypto. And I think this
100%.
situation really highlights that. It's that term trust but verify. Is trust no, it's okay to trust people, but verify that they're actually doing their integral things, and then that you're also making sure the onus at the end of the day is on you to make sure you're safe, you're secure there.
Yeah. So if you have hardware wallets or you want to have hardware wallets and you've got sort of questions about how they work, what to use, what's safe, what's the best option for you, feel free to reach out, come chat to our team. Like Patrick said, we do sell quite a few because we want everyone to have that choice. Or if you're not using a hardware wallet, you can still find good ways to secure your funds without them. So we're always happy to help on that point. And yeah, if you're in corporate comms, maybe take a few lessons out of the Ledger episode of what not to do when you're in a public debacle over a product launch.
Yeah, agreed, agreed. It will be interesting learnings for the time to come. Thank you all. That more or less wraps up this week's episode of the CEO and the Lobster. As always, thanks again for watching. And if you've got any ideas or suggestions about topics we should cover, please let us know. We're always happy to hear it. And we kind of, yeah, just want to talk about issues that interest the community and that you guys want to learn more about. So, yeah, thank you again for tuning in. We really appreciate it.
Till next time.